What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish at the Moment. Today, I'm gonna teach you the basics of how to fish a big worm offshore. So let's get into it. So first, let's talk about how I classify big worms. And basically, I consider a worm a big worm if it's over 8 inches long. And there are a ton of different worms on the market that fall in this category. And some of them are thinner, some of them are thicker. And so I want to show you some of the worms that I've used over the years and kind of talk about some of my favorites, as well as some overlooked big worms you may have not heard about before. So probably the most popular big worm on the market, my personal favorite, is the Zoom Old Monster. And this is a 10.5-inch ribbon tail worm, and it absolutely crushes them. And it's really not that thick of a body on this worm, and while it is a 10-inch worm, it will get a ton of bites from fish of all sizes, from your 10-inchers all the way up to your 10-pounders. And I've caught a lot of giant fish on this bait, as well as just a lot of good keeper-sized fish, 15-inchers to 2.5-pounders. And so this is a really good big worm to start with if you're getting into fishing a 10-inch worm or an 11-inch worm with a Texas rig or something like that. And if I was going to recommend one worm that you would throw anywhere across the country, it would be the Zoom Old Monster. And there are a lot of different colors this bait comes in, and when I'm fishing a big worm, I kind of stick to 3 different colors. One is a blue flake, so just a black and blue or kind of this blue flake worm. I also like a plum colored worm or a plum apple colored worm, as well as a green pumpkin worm. And so you'll see all those colors in the worms I'm about to show you here. And those are the 3 colors I really throw: green pumpkin, plum or plum apple, and then a blue flake worm. So those are the colors, and this is my #1 go-to worm, the Zoom Old Monster. Now, there are a lot of other big worms in the market that catch fish, and some of the more popular ones are the 10-inch Berkley power worm. This thing catches a ton of fish. It has a lot of good scent on it and comes in some really good colors. And so I have caught a lot of fish on the power worm over the years as well as the NetBait C-Mac 11-inch worm. This bait has a little bit thicker body than that Zoom Old Monster, and the tail is somewhat similar. It's pretty much a very similar bait, but there are a few differences between this and the Old Monster. But really, at the end of the day, the power worm, the C-Mac NetBait worm, as well as the Zoom Old Monster, they all pretty much will catch the exact same fish. It's more just personal preference. And so I go with the Zoom Old Monster just on price, and just I've been fishing it for so long. And so that's my go-to if I'm fishing a 10-inch ribbon tail worm. But there are a lot of other styles of worms in the market that are different from your traditional ribbon tail that also catch a lot of good fish. So one unique ribbon tail worm I've been experimenting with recently is the Bait's Tomahawk worm. This is an 8 3/4 inch double ribbon tail worm. It's kind of crazy. If you take a look at it, it has the same body as a Zoom Old Monster or power worm, but it has 2 ribbon tails on it. And this is super unique to big worms. Never seen any other worm do this. And this does get bit. I've caught some fish on it for sure. I'm not sure if it's a replacement for your traditional Zoom Old Monster single tail ribbon tail big worm, but I feel like if you're fishing on a highly pressured lake or on a lake that has some really big fish, but where there's a lot of fishing pressure from other tournament anglers or guys fishing the same brush piles, throwing a very unique double ribbon tail worm like this Bait's Tomahawk worm might trigger a few extra bites out of those bass that have become accustomed to your traditional 10-inch worms. And I know that on Lake Dardanelle, I've thrown this thing a few times and caught some really good fish right behind other anglers who are running the same brush piles as me, just because the bait has a different action, something a little bit different, more unique. And it may not be the cure-all, the best big worm on the market, but it's definitely something you should add into your rotation if you already are very comfortable fishing with big worms and want to try something different to trigger some extra bites. And there are a few other alternative big worms that I've caught fish on over the years, and one of them is the Strike King 10-inch Rage Anaconda worm. And this is a giant ribbon tail worm with this rage flange is what they call it. And as you can see, it just has this giant profile, and it pulls a ton of water when you cast it out into a brush pile on a ledge. And when the water is very dirty, I find that this worm will actually draw a lot more bites and some bigger bites, but it won't get the numbers that a C-Mac worm, an Old Monster, or a 10-inch power worm will get you. So this is a bait that I'll go to when I'm really going after those really big bass, and especially when I'm fishing in dirtier water where I need to basically move a lot of water to get those fish to feel that bait. And so this is one that I keep in the boat. I don't always throw it. I don't always have it tied on, but if I'm on a really good big worm bite and I feel like I need to just go for some quality bites over quantity, I'll throw on that 10-inch striking rage Anaconda worm. And another worm that I really like is actually the 10-inch striking rage Thumper worm. And this kind of has a little J tail on the bottom, and it has a very long profile. I can barely fit it in camera here. And it is this very long worm, and so that bait has a lot of side to side motion to it, and that J tail will kick a lot. And again, this is a worm that I'll go to when I really want to go after maybe a little bit bigger bite, but especially when the fish are very lethargic on offshore ledges. A lot of times guys will throw that 10-inch power worm down there and not get as many bites, but this really long skinny worm with that J tail on it will sometimes trigger a few extra bites. Maybe not as well as like a drop shot or a Carolina rig, but it's definitely something to give a shot. And it's kind of a cross between the ribbon tail worms we've been talking about and the next category of worms we're going to be talking about, which is the straight tail worm. And so this is kind of the bridge between them, and it's something you should definitely try if you haven't already. Again, the striking rage Thumper worm, 10-inch. So the next category of big worms we're going to be talking about are your straight tail big worms. So straight tail worms that are over 8 inches long. And the gold standard for this category is the man's jelly worm. It actually has a little bit of a paddle tail on the bottom, but it's mainly just a really long straight tail worm, and is what Paul Elias used to catch the biggest 4-day total for the Bassmasters, 132 pounds over 4 days on Lake Falcon, and is just this massive 12-inch worm. I think he was even throwing like a 14 or a 16-inch version of this, but I don't throw anything that big here in Arkansas, but I will tie on this 12-inch man's jelly worm at times. It has a really good action, and this is a bait that actually, because it has this very thin profile to it, will get your 2 to 2.5 pounders to eat it. It's not just a bait for your giant, 10 pounders, 8 pounders, even though it's a 12-inch worm. There are other big 12-inch worms like the Zoom Magnum Old Monster, or like the bigger version, the 12-inch version of the Old Monster, which are very thick and have a giant profile. This bait is not nearly as thick. It's very long and thin, and so you can get a ton of bites on this worm. And I find that when you're fishing in the middle of July and August, these really thin big worms will actually get you more bites than like a Zoom Old Monster ribbon tail worm. And I kind of go to this style worm more in that July and August time when water temperatures creep up, maybe even into the 90s here in Arkansas, or when it's very, very hot outside, 100-degree temperatures, maybe late summertime. But I'll stick with the ribbon tail worms when the fish first pull offshore in that May, June period, maybe into the first little bit of July. And so this is where I kind of separate these two categories. Straight tail worms and the thinner worms, late summertime, super hot weather. And then in that post-spawn to summer period, your ribbon tail worms are the way to go in that May and June time. Water temperatures may be below 85 degrees. Another great straight tail worm is the Strike King 10-inch bullworm, and this bait has a little bit thicker profile and maybe moves just a little bit more water than that 12-inch jelly worm, even though it's only 10 inches long. And so I'll go to this worm if I'm trying to, again, go for that bigger bite in the late summertime. And I'll start with the jelly worm, the 12-inch jelly worm, just to try to get some keepers in the boat. And then I'll go to the 10-inch bullworm just because it has that thicker profile. It's a little bit wider, it has a flat bottom, and it has a little concave tail, which is actually really nice. And so that is a worm that will get you a few bigger bites in that late summertime. And I'm not expecting to get more than maybe 2-3 bites all day on this. And even in that late summertime on the jelly worm, the 12-inch jelly worm, this is maybe a 10 bite a day technique if I'm really on them and on good brush piles. So don't expect to be going out with these big worms and crushing them in the late summertime, but it's definitely one of my favorite techniques for doing well in tournaments and catching those better than average bass. And then the last straight tail worm I like to throw is the Zoom Magnum trick worm. And I think this one comes in just a little bit below that 8-inch size, which I would classify as a big worm. But because it has this thicker profile and it's almost 8 inches, I will classify this as a big worm. And this is kind of my more finessey approach. And so if I am struggling in that late summer period, or even in the early summer to get bit on a 10-inch Old Monster or on even the 12-inch jelly worm, I'll just put this Zoom Magnum trick worm on a Texas rig and throw it around. And I'll throw it in a black color, black and blue, the plum apple, as well as a green pumpkin, and that's kind of my go-tos. And it's just a very simple straight tail worm, not a ton of action. It just kind of slowly moves through the water, but it will get some bites, especially when those fish are super lethargic, and we'll put them in the boat. And so definitely a bait that I have tied on in my big worm arsenal. And these are all the big worms I literally took out of my boat today. So got the Zooms, got some Powerbait worms, NetBait, Strike King, Mans, you can name it. I've got pretty much all the top worms in my boat, and I've caught fish on all of them. But if I really had to choose a couple worms to take out with me, really it would be the Zoom Old Monster 10-inch worm. That's a really good one. The Man's 12-inch jelly worm. That's just a standard classic, catches a lot of good fish. And then that Zoom Magnum trick worm. That 7-inch or 7.5-inch Magnum trick worm. Those would be my go-to big worms if I had only 3 to choose, but since I can carry more, I'll always have more in the boat and fish different ones in different situations to try to get bites. And you know, definitely experimenting with different worms, especially throwing worms that are different from what everyone else in the field is throwing in a tournament or what the other locals are throwing, will produce some better fish a lot of times and more numbers. So if you feel like everyone's throwing the big 10-inch Old Monster, maybe go to the Strike King worms or the Tomahawk worm on missile baits. You might get a few more bites. So in terms of how I'm rigging this 10-inch worm, I'm throwing it on a Texas rig about 90 to 95% of the time. And for my Texas rig, I'm basically just going to be using anywhere from a 1/4 ounce to a 1/2 ounce tungsten slip sinker. I'll be putting that with anywhere from a 4/0 to a 7/0 round bend offset worm hook. I use a Gamakatsu, and then I will Texas rig that bait just like you would any other plastic worm or creature bait. And you can also notice that I actually peg my slip sinker when I'm Texas rigging this worm. That's because I like to really throw this worm a lot in brush piles, and I find that this worm will come through brush a lot better when you have that weight pegged, because the worm will follow the weight as it's going through the brush, and a lot of times it will improve your hookup ratio as well as get you a few more bites. And so I will peg my sinker on my 10-inch worm probably 80% of the time. The only time that I will not peg it is if I know I'm only going to be throwing this worm over, let's say, shell beds or some hard bottom spots, or maybe even around brim beds. But if I want this thing coming in contact with some sort of cover like brush or standing timber, I'm going to be pegging my weight. And I'll link all of the equipment that I'm talking about, from the hooks, the weights, the pegs, everything like that, in the description of this video, as well as all the worms I've talked about as well. So definitely go down there if you want to get links directly to Tackle Warehouse with these baits. And then the last thing to talk about is the equipment I use in these 10-inch worms. And my go-to rod whenever I'm throwing a 10-inch worm is a 7'6" heavy action quantum smoke rod. And I like to throw something between 7'4" and 7'6" inches, and always a heavy action, because you're gonna be casting these big worms into deep water, into cover, and you want to have a rod that has a lot of backbone as well as has some length so that you can actually get some leverage to set the hook on these fish. And when I'm actually Texas rigging these worms, one thing I'm always doing is taking that hook, and instead of Texposing it, I'm literally just shoving it into that worm and then leaving it in the worm itself. I'm not putting that hook all the way through. And the reason I don't put that hook all the way through is to avoid hang-ups and brush and stuff like that. But as a result, because I'm just sticking that hook straight into the worm, not Texposing it, you need to make sure you have a rod with some good backbone so that when you set the hook, that hook will drive through the plastic of that worm and get in the fish's mouth. Now, all the worms I've shown you here have relatively soft plastic, so it shouldn't be a problem with hookups as long as you are using the right rod and setting the hook properly, which I'll talk about in other videos in terms of how to set the hook offshore. Make sure you actually penetrate these hooks into the fish's mouth. But 7'6" heavy action rod, that's my go-to, and I will be throwing that with anywhere between 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon line. I'll throw 15 pound when I'm fishing in relatively clear water, let's say 3+ feet of visibility. I'll go down to 17 pound or go up to 17 pound fluorocarbon when the water visibility is between that kind of 2 to 3 foot range, and then any water visibility below 2 foot, especially some really muddy water, I'm always throwing 20-pound fluorocarbon with this big worm, and I basically just try to throw the heaviest line I can get away with without feeling like I'm spooking the fish. And I'm always pairing all of my rods with Abu Garcia Black Max reels. This is a right-handed 6-4-1 Black Max, and they're $39 at Walmart. I've made videos about this before. I know some guys don't agree that these reels work. I have 12 of them on the deck of my boat right now, and I've not had a problem with literally any of them. I've been running them for like a year and a half. So $39 Black Max, not a bad investment. So that's the equipment, those are the baits. Now let's talk about how to retrieve this big worm, where to fish it, how to fish it, and the situations you need to be throwing this worm in. Let's start by talking about when to fish a big worm. And I'll have a big worm tied on anytime the water temperature is above 70 degrees, so pretty much the summer time of the year. I don't throw big worms during the winter time. I prefer a jig when that water temperature is below 70 degrees. But for some reason, when that water temperature starts to warm up, I'll get a lot more bites and some bigger bites on that 10-inch worm as opposed to a jig or a Carolina rig in certain situations. Now, I do throw a jig a lot in the summer as well and catch a lot of big fish. And so I use a big worm as one of my tools in my arsenal, but it's not the exclusive bait I throw when I'm fishing offshore. And big worms are great because they work in pretty much any water clarity. I've caught bass in lakes with 6 inches visibility and lakes with 15 feet of visibility in the summertime. And this bait works really well when you have bright sunny skies and calm conditions, and those bass are lethargic. Bass tend to like that long, slender profile of a 10-inch worm over a lot of other baits when the fishing is tough in the summer. So my favorite place to fish a big worm is in offshore brush piles. And I have one actually marked right here in front of me. And so let me explain what a good offshore brush pile looks like, how to find them, and then I'm gonna get into the retrieve of how I actually fish this worm through that brush pile. Brush piles are trees or piles of logs that are out in the middle of the lake, and they're usually not naturally occurring. They're placed there by other fishermen or by your local Game and Fish Commission. And this is what a brush pile will look like on your side imaging and down imaging unit. And I've actually made a complete guide to brush pile fishing on my channel before that gets into what types of brush piles to look for, how to identify fish in brush piles, and a lot of other topics. So I'll send you that video if you want to know more. But in this video, I just want to talk about how to find brush piles. And as I mentioned earlier, brush piles are usually not naturally occurring. This means that they're placed by other anglers on offshore structure or out in the middle of the lake. And when I'm looking for brush piles, I usually start by looking for obvious structural elements offshore, whether that is an offshore point, a hump, a ledge, or other areas where you have a drop off from shallower water to deeper water. And like my complete guide to brush piles video, I've actually made a complete guide to contour line maps, and I explain how to identify different types of structures on a contour line map like the ones I just mentioned. And so check out that video if you want to learn more. And I'm usually going to start my search for brush piles around these structural elements because if people are planting brush piles out there, that's where they like to put them. But not everyone puts their brush piles in obvious areas because, well, they don't want other anglers to find them. And so I also find a lot of brush piles on flat, nothing-looking banks with very little changes in depth or obvious structural elements. And that's because anglers are trying to hide these brush piles. And so most of the time I'm just going to graph over very subtle sloping banks or very kind of ugly, nothing looking areas with my side imaging to try to identify brush piles. And once I find a good brush pile, I'm going to mark it with a waypoint and then either use my electronics to line up on that brush pile and make a cast on it, or drop an orange marker buoy next to that brush pile so that I can make a cast directly in the center of that brush pile with that 10-inch worm. Now I've made a video explaining exactly how to hit offshore structure spots that you find in your electronics by using electronics and using a marker buoy. So if you are having trouble hitting offshore structure spots, check out this video. And so now that we have found the brush piles, we've lined up on them, we know how to cast on them, let's talk about the retrieve I use with that big worm to put big bass in the boat. So I've got a brush pile right in front of me here, and I put an orange marker buoy to mark where it is. And so what I'm gonna do is take my 10-inch worm, I'm gonna cast it past my marker buoy, which means I'm casting it over the top of that brush pile, and I'm gonna let that bait sink all the way to the bottom. And this is one of the most crucial steps of fishing a 10-inch worm. You have to make sure that bait gets all the way down to the bottom. That means that when I have this big slack in my line, this big bow in my line, I want to see it stop moving before I start moving the bait. Whenever that line is moving across the surface of the water, that means that bait is still falling and it hasn't reached the bottom yet. And it's important that that worm is on the bottom to get the most bites possible. And so if you aren't sure if your bait's hitting the bottom, just watch your line, wait till it stops moving, maybe give it an extra 5 or 6 seconds, then start moving that worm. And when I'm actually moving the worm, all I'm doing is reeling up my slack and then dragging my bait to the side. And I might sweep it anywhere from 2 to 3 feet to the side, and I'm not going to move it very fast. So I'll basically sweep it to the side a couple feet. I'm in that brush pile right there. Then I'm going to let it sit for anywhere from 3 to 4 seconds before moving it again. And a 10-inch worm is not a bait that you're going to use to cover a lot of water. Basically, you're fishing a specific target with this worm, which is that brush pile. And so you don't need to move that bait a lot once you get it around the target you're fishing. And so sometimes, I might drag that worm up to the brush pile. And once I get in it like I am now, I might hop it up like this and raise it up over the limbs of the brush and then let it sit there. And sometimes I might just dead stick that worm in that brush pile for 15 or 20 seconds, especially in the middle of the day when you have bright bluebird skies like we have now and no wind. A lot of times to get the bites on that worm, you just have to let it soak there and maybe even just kind of shake your rod a little bit and just put it right in front of those fish for as long as possible. And every once in a while, one will see it sitting there in the brush pile, he'll suck it down, and it'll be game on. So again, my favorite place to fish a big worm offshore is in brush piles. And I'm probably throwing them in brush piles 70 to 80% of the time when I have one tied on. But the other place I'll throw a 10-inch worm is actually on offshore shell beds. And shell beds are basically mussel shells that have accumulated on top of ledges, humps, and points. And if you don't know what those types of structures are, check out this video. It'll explain all of that. And I'll also link some videos on how you can identify shell beds on your fish finder. And so fishing a 10-inch worm around shell beds is a very productive and effective technique for catching fish, and it will outperform a lot of other baits like a jig or a crankbait in those situations, just because that bait is really big, drags around the bottom, and catches a lot of fish. Now, I don't fish a 10-inch worm in rock very often or in offshore grass. I'll usually fish a jig in those situations. And so really, when I'm throwing that worm, I want to fish it around very specific targets, whether it's a specific brush pile or a specific shell bed that I've marked, and I have a, let's say, 10-foot radius that I'm throwing at, or maybe an area the size of the front deck of my boat here. You don't want to try to cover water with this worm and drag it around. This is a target-specific bait. So guys, that's it for this video. Hopefully you learned something about how to fish a 10-inch worm offshore in the summertime to catch some really big bass. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment down below, let me know what you think. Also, like the video, and if you want more content like this from Fish the Moment, subscribe to my YouTube channel using the button down below. So thanks again for checking out the video, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.